Alright YouTube, it's time for the Occult, video 133. Now there are a few links in the description to basic information about some of these things on New England megaliths and other remains. Now I'll also include a link to a sort of speech given by one individual. I can't remember his name. I should probably have looked that up before the video, but that's okay. You'll see it in the description here on YouTube regarding some of the stone mounds and so for the mound builders. And some of the remains in New England as well, megalithic in nature, so-called megalithic. Of course, a simple, sort of single-room structure, 5 feet tall by maybe 10 feet deep, made out of rocks, is not really a megalith, so to speak. It's just an out-of-place sort of archaeological remain. Now, I'll drag in here my own training here in Vermont, of course, within archaeology and so forth. The stone remains that we have here, called cairns, or just remains in general. There are several in this state. There are others scattered around the New England and northern New York region. They are often on mountainsides. They're in particularly remote locations. The idea that they're astrological in nature, I believe, has been largely debunked upon the notion that the areas that they were built in were old growth, deep forest at the time, actually, that they were built. The one over near Woodstock, where I grew up, it's only a few miles from there. It's on a hillside deep in the woods. I've actually been inside of it. It's not a colonial remain. It's not associated with any colonial remnants of European culture that were anywhere near the area. The nearest sort of colonial buildings that you'd find would be miles and miles away, so it wasn't exactly being used at that time. And some of these remains were already documented earlier on anyway by people. They were coming here for, maybe the first time and found these remains, these sort of stone rooms, you could call them. Essentially what they're comprised of. You have a doorway, simple lintel structure, rectangular. Inside, a modern human typically would hunch over because they could be taller than the roof, like myself. Obviously, being more than 6 feet tall, I couldn't stand up straight in them. They're perhaps 6 to 10 feet wide and 10 or more feet deep, built into hillsides usually, flat coverings on top. There are no petroglyphs or anything of that nature, it appears, within at least most of them, although there is some scrawling upon one that may or may not even be from when it was made. It could be something totally modern. Here in this state, what's happened with these remains, and I'll get into my opinion of how they got here, who built them, in a moment. Generally, they're sort of left alone. They're not even really studied. There are no real excavations taking place around them because they're claimed as Native American remnants. Now, if you know anything about the natives that inhabited this particular area, the tribes here, Abenaki and so forth, they did not build such structures. They had no use for such structures. They have no oral tradition about having made these structures. That's just a sort of power play by these tribes, essentially. I happen to disagree with them. I happen to believe that archaeology should not always necessarily bow before the whims of so-called native people. I don't. And I say this as someone who supposedly has some Abenaki blood from the region. I think science is more important than that, than preserving some remain that you don't even know why it's there because you're not even allowed to dig around it and study it. I think if you conducted excavations around them, you'd find, in my opinion, that these are European remains from earlier groups of Europeans prior to full colonization that made it over here. Some sort of group that probably got into New England at some time. It might have been Irish explorers and some of their sort of Catholic, their monk traditions. They have ideas about having explored faraway lands. It could have been Vikings. It could have been any number of people. I happen to think that probably Irish is the most likely myself, Irish or Welsh travelers. They came and they built structures that were roughly similar to what you see in the British Isles, actually. Could have been Scottish as well. Some people drag in some of the conspiracy stuff. Oh, it was this group of Freemasons taking the Holy Grail to the New World, and they also did Oak Island. Well, I've already talked about Oak Island. I do think that it's artificial, although it's not clear that the hole they're currently exploring is even the same hole they originally dug out back in the colonial era, so I'm not sure how much it's worth trying to look into it. I think that the handful of remains that have been supposedly found there are evidence that there's something there. I don't think it's the Holy Grail. I don't think it's the Ark of the Covenant. I think some pirate or some group of British people buried a bunch of treasure there and left it, and happened to have a drainage system installed so that nobody could get at it unless they knew how to actually dig in from the side and not be total ass fucks about it. As far as the cairns or whatever they may be here in New England, I do associate them with the mound builders insofar as the people, the mounds, oddly enough, basically end where these stone structures begin. And the mound builders, of course, died out. I think that's quite mysterious, too. I look at Serpent Mound and some of these things that we know to be old. We know them to be artificial. It's kind of obvious. The general prevailing wisdom among many within archaeology is that many of those mounds actually are not artificial at all. They were created by the drainage of water off of the plains or something, creating these mounds. But when you find them in proximity to mounds that you know not to be natural, that you know to be artificial, they show clear evidence of that. You've got remains, you've got burial remains and tools and things, copper instruments. You as well have straight lines, often petroglyphs and so forth. That, to me, it leads me to believe that most of them are artificial. Some may be natural. That's entirely possible. Of course, hills do form in nature, but many of them, no, they're not. They're artificial. Then you go east, you come here, and you find these stone monuments. They have nothing in common with any native tradition that I know of, unless you wish to go all the way out to the Hopi or something like that, or down to see Montezuma's castle, or one of these similar structures that aren't necessarily made of the same materials or in the same form, but they have some overlapping similarity. So unless somebody wishes to suggest to me that a group of Hopi Indians or other western coast tribes came all the way to the eastern coast to New England to build these for no reason, I think it's more safe to assume that this is some early... It makes sense that it would be in this particular location. It makes sense that it would be here in this area, because it would be closer to Europe. It would have been perhaps the first place they would have landed if they were departing from the British Isles. They would have landed here. They would have gone inland in search of, exploration, goods, and so forth. Maybe they were trying to get back. Maybe they just said, this is a virgin land. We're just going to settle here. And so they moved around. They did their nomadic thing, and they were basically regressed to hunter-gatherers, made these stone monuments. At some point, they died out, and their remains could be completely decimated by now. You wouldn't necessarily know who made them. I think if you look at like the main penny, perhaps we have a link to who created these things. It's like the Kensington stone, which isn't a megalith. It's just an archaeological relic. I happen to believe that when that one dude, that geologist, took a look at it and said, yes, indeed, this is hundreds of years old, I believe that. Because I'm going to assume that if he studied geology, he probably knows what he's talking about when he's dating the age of a rock inscription. I believe that it's a genuine remain. I do not believe that it's a hoax. It doesn't, to me, appear to show signs of being a hoax. I'd have to go physically examine it myself in order to be sure. But reliable enough witnesses to suggest that it's real, I think it just makes sense. To me, anyway. It makes sense that it could mark some actual expedition. If we know that certain groups of Europeans probably found their way at least up into the Canadian regions at the time, why couldn't they have gone further? Then we have, like, the Newport Tower. Now, the Newport Tower, as far as I can tell, is a colonial remnant. It's not antiquated at all. It's just the base of a once perhaps larger tower that happens to have been placed there. I don't think it has anything, again, to do with like the Holy Grail stuff. Then you have America's Stonehenge, which is probably the most famous in this region. It's funny because more people know about America's Stonehenge, thanks to In Search Of and so forth, than they know about these actual legit archaeological remains that we can say are old. We don't know who created them necessarily, but we can say they're quite old. America's Stonehenge, to me, the ritual altar that people speak of there was probably indeed just a spot for butchering animals and draining the blood or making soap or whatever. I think it's recent. I think it's colonial era. Specifically, not that much older than when people first began actually speaking about it, because otherwise we probably would have found some mention of such remains, because the area had already been settled long before. People would have been aware of it if it had been present. The fact is, this was probably a processing center of some sort some time before that. The people who first found it, of course, dicked around on the site and actually moved things around, so good luck trying to figure out exactly what's going on there. So I think the most interesting sites are the ones that it seems the fewest people know about, and which are actually quite small, scattered around, and not frequent in number. There are I think, about a dozen of them scattered around New England. And those are the simple stone monuments that have been made for some purpose. They do not appear to have been used for burials. They don't appear to have been used for food storage. They don't appear to have had an astronomical purpose. So who built them and why? Another possibility is that if some migrant group from Ireland, from Wales, from the Viking lands did make it here and built these things, maybe they planned to use them as burial sites, only to repeatedly be harassed by the native people, moving from place to place, continuously rebuilding these same monuments in much the same form wherever they went, until eventually they exhausted themselves and die, or interbred with natives, or perhaps built a ship and went back to Europe, or something along those lines, with an oral history that would have been largely forgotten, potentially. It's entirely possible that that's the case, but I look to a European explanation for these stone monuments. I do not believe that they're native in origin. The Native Americans around here weren't building that sort of thing. If we're looking to the mound builders and some of these other remains, we are looking at Mesoamericans. Those we know to be Mesoamerican remains, quite clearly. This particular style of monument, though, much like Newport Tower or America's Stonehenge, is not Mesoamerican. And unlike Newport Tower or America's Stonehenge, where there's pretty good indicators that they're fairly modern, in the human terms, of course, these predate that sort of colonial era. I believe they were built by some rogue group of Irish or Welsh or Scottish explorers, possibly Vikings, somebody along those lines. Then again, there's always the vague possibility that even earlier than that, some random group of people washed out by a storm were going in the wrong direction and ended up here 1,000 years before that happened. It's not so difficult to think of that being a possibility. If they were supplied properly, they could have made the voyage. It would have been difficult, but if you have all sorts of people blown out to sea from time to time, it's entirely possible one of them made their way here. What if we suddenly find the remains of a trireme right off the coast of New England? It would practically rewrite all of human history. It'd be, I mean, the effects would be widespread in archaeology as well as in human society itself. And it could happen. We've had these sort of overthrows of human thought before. For most of science, we thought Troy was just a myth. Oh, it never existed. It's a story. We now know, of course, Troy quite literally did exist. The story is technically true. Maybe not all aspects of it. They were blown out of proportion. Does that mean, by the way, and here's an interesting question to pose to people who are interested in thinking about this sort of thing, does that mean that the Odyssey has a kernel of truth to it? Does that mean that Odysseus was an actual real person? That the events there were, minus some of the the supernatural stuff, were actually real? That he did travel all around, being lost from place to place due to poor weather and other problems, and all of these things actually happened? I think it's a possibility myself. I think it's entirely possible that that's actually true. That's about all. Peace out.